as the Center for Personalized Medicine. So Dr. Meddens studies how socioeconomic inequalities are affected by the interaction between genetic risks and the environment. And as part of her Marie Curie Fellowship, she'll be conducting research into links between genetics, educational attainment, and social inequality. And these are themes that are very much at the core of the Center for Personalized Medicine's mission. So the CPM is a partnership between the University of Oxford's Wellcome Centre for Human Genetics and St. Anne's College. And it is a communication and engagement vehicle for students, academics, clinicians, and the public to explore the benefits and challenges of personalized medicine. And we're therefore really delighted to welcome Dr. Meddens, and I'll hand over to you now to start the seminar if you're ready and happy to do that.
Great, yeah, thank you, Poik, and thank you everyone for joining after getting postponed the first time. But yeah, I'm all well now, my voice is recovered, so I'm happy to present this to you. So indeed, I'm going to talk about rank concordance of polygenic indices. Specifically, if you create a polygenic index, there's different ways you can create them. Do people score similarly high or similarly low on different polygenic indices for the same trait? So that's what I'm going to talk about. Before I kick off, I want to talk about my team of co-authors who've been working with me on this. So these are all people that were funded by the Norface network, which actually are, so this ended this week. Actually, we weren't working on anything personalized, but we were working on gene-environment interactions also for inequalities in health and education. It's just that we kind of came across, we were starting to create polygenic scores in different ways, summary statistics were coming in. We're updating LDPRED according to, Python 3 and stuff. And we had different scores and we were thinking, okay, I have this one score and people score high on it. Do they also score high on this other score that we're still, that's still in the pipeline and that we're still creating? And then we tried to look at that and it turned out there are pretty big differences. Before I kick off, I kind of want to start about, give you some background on polygenic terminology and at least how I see it. So I think you already heard me switch between polygenic index and polygenic score, just to explain that a little bit. So kind of if you're working with, not necessarily disease traits, but, common traits, behavior traits, kind of the neutral term to use is polygenic score, so PGIs. I've also seen people use genome-wide polygenic score, so GPS. And now you kind of see the field moving to polygenic index. And that's because it's kind of considered a more neutral term, especially for kind of like politically sensitive traits, with this idea that scoring high, has a connotation of scoring high in a test or scoring high in a game. And whereas we're just looking at indices. So, but I'm still getting used to that terminology. So you'll see me switch between PGS, polygenic score, PGI, polygenic index, but all means the same thing. Then for diseases and health risk traits, people are using genetic risk score, GRS, or polygenic risk score, PRS. So that's kind of like, just to give you some background on, if you're working with polygenic indices or polygenic scores, these are the type of acronyms you'll find. Then I just wanted to start with a kind of timeline from GWAS to real life utility. So what we're now seeing with this boon of people showing utility for personalized medicine with polygenic scores. So, I mean, the expectations were huge, starting from discovery of the helix structure of DNA, then Sanger sequencing in 1977. Then finally Human Genome Project completed in 2003. And I think that was the point that everyone's thinking, okay, well, we have this genetic data, it's going to be life-changing. And then in 2005, we had the first reference genomes that we can impute to. So we can now look at millions of SNPs through imputation. 23andMe was launched, so people can send in their own DNA and get some nice profiles of health risks. And then the first actual polygenic score that was created was for schizophrenia, and that was in 2008. I started my PhD in 2014, and around that time, or right before that time, actually, I feel like general tendency for people to say was, GWAS is a fail. We're kind of seeing so much missing heritability. We don't have any hits for this complex trait. So for instance, depression in the beginning was a trait that was very difficult to find genome-wide significant SNPs for. And also the effect sizes are negligible. So that was kind of when I started my PhD, that was, I feel like for a lot of scientists, epidemiologists, that was their general idea of, oh, what a letdown. And then we go to 2015, and that's really when I think the utility of polygenic indices or scores were demonstrated. And this was with a study that showed that people who rank high on a polygenic score for cardiovascular disease really benefit from statin treatment, and people who score low really do not. So this was really first, was study in the Lancet. That was the first study showing, like, hey, what can this actually, polygenic scores might be useful for clinical, for a clinic. And then in 2018, the cost of the SNP array fell down to below $40 US, and now I think it's around $25 US for a SNP array. So oftentimes it's measuring DNA is actually a lot cheaper than doing loads of questionnaires and getting people into the clinic. So that's another way of justifying the use of genetic data. Then how clinical utility is typically described for polygenic scores is that people say, well, we can support diagnosis for people who are kind of on the edge of a diagnosis, or we're not really sure what type of disease they're showing. We can use it for prognosis or, age of onset, for treatment decisions, and for targeted screening. So there was a nice review in 2018 that kind of focused on a bunch of traits. So cardiovascular disease, especially with, people scoring high, we could say, they're eligible for drugs or that they should focus on their lifestyle. Prostate and breast cancer are being mentioned, and Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease. And I think that these traits were really in the review is because these traits have genome-wide significant SNPs, and they're showing some explained variance. But for some of them, you can really wonder, like inflammatory bowel disease, for instance. Why? So the goal there would say, well, we could identify clinical trial populations, but and for Alzheimer's, there's not really much we can do to delay that disease. So some diseases are perhaps better candidates for personalized medicine than others. And then kind of the way to envision that is to, see polygenic scores as probabilistic risk factors. So if you're in the top 20% of a polygenic score, we're still going to see more healthy people than diseased people, but the risk certainly gets a lot larger. And this is a figure showing the number needed to treat to prevent a heart attack, to detect breast cancer, and to detect prostate cancer. Like how many people, so then the light blue guys are the ones that are healthy, and then the dark blue guy is the one that's actually a disease. Then, so I'm personally working a lot with education polygenic scores, and this is always where it gets a bit controversial because there are people in favor of personalizing education. So a really famous proponent of this is Robert Plomin. He's basically saying, predictive power of education polygenic scores can be seen at the extremes of a distribution. And perhaps precision education could be based on polygenic scores to customize education, similar to precision medicine. So that's kind of like, for disease traits, it's pretty obvious how we could potentially use them, but of course you could apply that same methodology to other traits. Even more controversial is that there are companies that will assist you with embryo selection, which is legal in many countries. It's legal in many states in the USA. And when I started looking into this, I feel like every year I look for an update, see what they're up to. I noticed that the first baby was born last year, who was selected on a good profile for based on disease traits. So that's what they're saying. Then prior to 2021, they also offered screening for intellectual disability and for short stature. They removed that now, although their founder is still in favor. You can see that here. They did create some type of risk profile, and this is what you could choose from as a parent. And then one thing I really wanted to point out here is absolute risk versus relative risk. So they're saying, especially for type 1 diabetes, seeing a really, really high relative risk, but when you look at the absolute risk, still very, very small. So it's still, kind of difficult, I think, as a parent, but also as a clinician, how we interpret these things. So what I'm going to show you today is how bad our prediction is for individuals and why these type of uses are probably not a good idea. And if you want to get some, ammunition, philosophical ammunition for why this is probably not a good idea, I really recommend Micah Sandel's The Case Against Perfection, which you can read on the Atlantic website, which was about genetic engineering, but I think the same principles apply to polygenic score selection. Right. So we can create these polygenic scores, and we definitely see that when we compare people at the bottom of a distribution to people at the top of a distribution, and we look at their relative risk, this becomes a lot, this is, especially when comparing extremes, we can see huge differences. So this is for schizophrenia, with relative risk calculated in 3 different samples. And we're seeing that, people in the top 10% of the polygenic score, they have between around a 10-fold odds of having schizophrenia compared to the bottom. For educational attainment, similar figure. This is the mean college completion for the lowest quintile and the highest quintile, and we can in 2 different samples. And we can see in the lowest quintile, the mean completion is around 10%. And in the highest quintile, this is around 50%. So, on average, when we look at people at extreme ends of the distribution, we're definitely seeing differences. But this is almost kind of misleading, because when we look at variance at every level of a polygenic score distribution, we see so much overlap that it's really hard to make an accurate prediction for an individual, and just looking at the mean is misleading. So this is a scatter plot showing polygenic score, and then years of education on the y-axis, and you can just see that, at every level of polygenic score, we see every type of attainment in education. Certainly trend, and it's, we're seeing an R-square of 11%, so it's explained phenotypic variance, so that's, it's considerable, but the variance, it's still massive. And if you see, similar picture, polygenic score for education attainment and fluid intelligence, for sure the averages are different between the bottom and the top decile, but just the overlap in distributions and just the variance is still very large. So just looking at those averages is quite misleading. Now, adding another axis of variation on top of this is that you can create a polygenic score in different ways. There is no the polygenic score for a certain trait. And you can almost see this, and especially when you see scientists, explaining their research and to the media. We could use the polygenic score, and people scoring high or low on the polygenic score, we could select them for whatever intervention. But there is no the polygenic score. It's basically, there's loads of researchers' degrees of freedom in how you create that score. So a polygenic score is a weighted sum of allelic effects, where we have the alleles here represented with gamma and their effect with beta. So this basically shows you 2 methodological choices. So which SNPs you select, and how do you determine your beta? Now, this is important because SNPs are often perfectly collinear. So we often see SNPs that are in perfect LG with each other. So we can't just throw everything into one model. We need to do some type of selection. And also, the number of SNPs is so much larger than the number of individuals we have in our model. So we're typically working with, millions of SNPs. We don't have millions of individuals. So statistically, it's not a model we can identify. So we also, again, we can't just throw everything into one model, into one regression model. So that's why we have these advanced polygenic score construction methods. Then another choice you can make is which GWAS summary statistics do you put into this score? So some summary statistics, for instance, are hard to access. So it's like, especially for like 23andMe and a lot of cancers, they're difficult to get access to. And another thing that we're doing as a research group is to boost the GWAS with, for instance, we have access to UK Biobank. For us, it's more powerful to choose a small holdout sample and then do a GWAS in the rest of UK Biobank and boost our score. So that's another, a choice as a researcher you have to make is, which summary statistics will feed into my score. Then the most commonly used methods are definitely Plink. So Plink, clumping and thresholding, some people say pruning and thresholding. I think clumping is a more accurate description, because with clumping, what you do is you keep the most significant SNP in the LD block, and then you throw out the rest. And then that's how you kind of solve that collinearity issue between SNPs. Then you can play around with the p-value threshold for retaining the most significant SNP. So you could say, well, I want the most significant SNP in the block to reach genome-wide significance, or I really, or I'm just going to put it that value at 1. I want to retain everything in the genome, information of every LD block, and then kind of a software that does that automatically for you is precise. Then there are Bayesian approaches that don't focus on SNP selection, but they actually focus on reweighting the beta. And then another thing you could, in principle, do is a lasso, so penalized regression. That's something you're also seeing. And then there's other approaches, of course, but these are the most often used ones that we see in the literature. Okay, so that's kind of background. I'm going to show you some results from when we started comparing polygenic scores, and also some results from simulations. So we wanted to know, how do the polygenic score methods compare in terms of rank concordance? So someone scores in the top 20% of an LD-PRED score, do they also score in the top 20% of a Plink score, for instance? So we decided to keep it simple and for now focus on Plink, where we did CNT, clumping and thresholding with a p-value threshold of 1. So retaining information from every LD block, versus LD-PRED, where we do a prior fraction of causal SNPs also of 1. So we're retaining as much information as we can. And then we use different GWAS sum stats, so dependent on the trait. So for education, we had access to 23andMe. For cardiovascular disease, we had the cardiogram cohort and UK Biobank. And then we also compare, okay, what happens when we meta-analyze them. So why we chose these two is, Plink clumping and thresholding is widely used. For instance, if you want to use health and retirement study publicly available polygenic scores, they use Plink. And they're very easy to access, so that's why a lot of people use these scores. It's quite easy to code, it's computationally tractable, and it's quite easy to understand what this algorithm does. So that's why I think Plink is quite a popular construction method. But it also kind of throws away the baby with the bathwater, because it keeps only one SNP in the LD block. And we kind of know now from research that often there's more than one causal SNP in LD blocks often. So you're throwing away information. Then we're kind of seeing that LD-PRED is becoming the new standard, but it's computationally much more intense. It's much more difficult to code and install, and also to understand the algorithm. But it retains more information. That's why I often see that LD-PRED scores have better explained variance than Plink scores. And that's why for now, we're just comparing these two. The kind of empirical application that I'm going to show you now is on cardiovascular disease. So the question, who should be described cholesterol-lowering drugs, so the statins. There are current guidelines that show that, well, if your LDL cholesterol is super high, then you should get statins to lower your risk of developing a cardiovascular event, heart attack, basically. Or if your LDL cholesterol, maybe it's not high, but it's borderline and you have diabetes, or your LDL cholesterol is borderline again, so elevated, but you have an elevated risk of developing an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease event. So again, a cardiovascular event in the next 10 years. More on that on the next slide. So that's kind of the guidelines that are now in place, especially in the USA. Now, the American Heart Association welcomes the use of other risk-enhancing factors to make their models more precise, and especially for those who are at a risk of developing a heart attack of at least 5% in the next 10 years. Then defining the risk for developing a cardiovascular event, it's based on a 10-year hazard model in white American population. They also do other populations. I'm focusing now on European ancestry, so that's the one that I'm referring to. And then they're saying, well, high risk is 7.5%, and then intermediate risk is 5%. That's 10-year risk of developing a cardiovascular event. And then the predictors that go into this model are pretty simple. It's sex, age, whether you're a smoker, whether you have diabetes, what your blood pressure is, your HDL with good cholesterol, your total cholesterol, plus some interactions. So you could see that currently they're using basically LDL cholesterol plus this model. Now, we're kind of inspired by this paper by Aragam et al. In 2020. And what they were showing is that these extra risk factors that the American College of Cardiology is recommended, that could be a polygenic score. So what they're saying is, an additional 4% of primary prevention patients may be recommended for statin therapy if a high cardiovascular disease polygenic risk score, with that they mean the top 20%, were considered a guideline-based risk-enhancing factor. So that was their conclusion, and they had a PGIs for cardiovascular disease that was based on LD-PRED. They used a cardiogram 2015 GWAS, and they basically showed that the polygenic score did not correlate with the statin recommendation status. So it was really something, this polygenic score is really something that's independent of the classic predictors. Why not use that information? So they used a LD-PRED cardiogram score. Let's see if I can create these scores differently, not just with cardiogram. I'm also going to use UK Biobank. I'm going to try Blink. I'm going to meta-analyze, creating all these different scores. How much overlap is there in the people who are recommended statins according to different scores? That's what I'm going to show you. So yeah, we're working with cardiovascular disease. Our holdouts or training, our holdout sample is the UK Biobank siblings. This kind of why? Because it's easier if we decide to do within sibling analysis and we had a GWAS pipeline in place. Then we have DMOR summary statistics that we're using. They're from Cardiogram 2015 and our own GWAS in the UK Biobank. We're making sure that the UKB siblings are, not in the GWAS, and anyone related to the UKB siblings is not in the GWAS. So we have two independent samples. Then we're creating polygenic scores. We're using LD-PRED, we're using Plink. And yeah, that's our UK Biobank siblings, our holdout. To give you a bit of background of how these two GWAS summary statistics are different. So cardiogram it's mostly European ancestry, but it's also using various Asian ancestry and a small number of African Americans and Hispanic ancestry people. Has around 60,000 cases, and the SNP-based heritability that I calculated with all these scores is around 7%. I realized this morning I didn't convert that on the genetic liability scale, so that might be a little bit overestimated, just to show you. Then we ran our own GWAS in the UK Biobank, focusing on European ancestry folks, 30,000 cases. So that's around 7% of people who either say they've had a cardiovascular event, or according to hospital records, we know that they've had a cardiovascular event, and there are SNP-based heritabilities around 3.6%. The genetic correlation is very high between these, around almost equal to 1, basically, 0.96. Then the holdout that we're using. I told you we're using UK Biobank siblings, but because I want to look at who should be prescribed statins, I want to remove everyone who is already using statins, because it wouldn't make sense for me to recommend statins when they're already using them, who are healthy with respect to cardiovascular disease. So basically, the idea is that they're currently healthy, they're currently not using statins, but they might be at risk. So, and also statins are not yet recommended with current guidelines. So that's my holdout sample. And then I'm also picking people who have a 10-year cardiovascular event risk of over 5%. So these are really the people flagged by the American College of Cardiology, saying, these people are borderline risk. We need extra information to cater a treatment recommendation for them. So then I create polygenic scores quintiles. So I'm basically asking who's in the top 20%. I'm doing I'm creating those quintile cutoffs based on the full sibling holdout sample. So people who do have cardiovascular disease, people who do use statins, with the idea that if I'm not going to use the cutoffs based on these people, I'm missing people at the very end tail. I'm residualizing the polygenic scores on sex, age, and principal components, and then I create the quintiles of the residual. So that's analytic details. Now, I'm showing you results for 5 different polygenic scores, and this is the histogram for that. So I'm seeing that most people don't rank in the top quintile for any of these 5. Then there's the people who rank, they rank high on 1 quintile, or 2, 3, 4, or 5. But you're seeing that basically the people who rank high in every single polygenic score is absolute minority. These are the people that I'm going to show you in a Venn diagram in the next slide. Around 4,000 people. This is how I decided to visualize that. So I'm asking who of these people who I'm kind of considering for statin treatment, they're ranking in the top quintile at least 1 score, but do they also rank in the top quintile of other scores? And if so, which ones? So here we're seeing the UKB cardiogram LD-PRED score. This is our best score. It's it's meta-analysis with the best construction method of the 2 that we use. I'm looking at just UK Biobank GWAS, LD-PRED, just UK Biobank GWAS with blink clumping thresholding, just cardiogram with blink clumping and thresholding, and just cardiogram with LD-PRED. So ideally, I would like to see a very nice dark center, right? So you're seeing loads of people, just loads of overlap between all these different scores. But that's exactly not what we're seeing. When we were seeing loads of people who only score high on the cardiogram blink score and not on anything else, or scoring high on the cardiogram blink score and the cardiogram LD-PRED score, but not on the UK Biobank scores and not on the meta-analysis scores. The highest number of people are actually, the highest fraction of people are people who score high on UK Biobank LD-PRED, UK Biobank and cardiogram LD-PRED, UK Biobank clumping and thresholding, but not on the cardiogram only scores. So there seems to be kind of despite this super high genetic correlation between cardiogram and UK Biobank, there's a disconnect between scoring high in the quintiles. So let's say a researcher decides to use a cardiogram LD-PRED score and saying, these people are scoring high, on this score. I'm going to say you need statins. 90, you know, there's 400 people of those who score high on this score, but not on any of the other ones. So, of course, that's a function of the rank correlations between the polygenic scores. And it's already kind of showing what you expect. So seeing basically high rank correlations between scores that have UK Biobank in them, but then lower rank correlations between cardiogram and UK Biobank. And the worst rank correlation is for the UK Biobank Plink score versus the cardiogram Plink score. Rank correlation is only 0.19. And that's kind of what's explaining, you know, this pattern where we're seeing a disconnect between scoring high on UK Biobank GWAS summary statistics versus scoring high on cardiogram summary statistics. So it's kind of surprising. It was kind of surprising to me because their genetic correlation was so high. And also when I'm looking at the odds ratio of the top quintile in the full sample. So these are people that have disease, and I'm, you know, running a logit regression. The odds ratios are not so different from each other. I mean, of course, our top score is this one. It's UK Biobank and cardiogram made with LDPRED. But they're all around, you know, around 2. So what to use? Then we're kind of like thinking, how can we visualize this differently? So I just showed you ranking in the top quintile versus not, which is a binary thing. But I can also show you switching between the deciles. So when I'm comparing methods, so this is for meta-analysis. This is, you know, people are in the bottom decile, people are in the top decile, and kind of the diameter of the circle shows how many people there are. You know, there's overlap between there. I mean, that diagonal is looking quite crowded, but there's still people, you know, who's scoring high on the LDPRED score, but not on the clump score. Okay, but I mean, the difference is not huge. If I'm then comparing discovery cohorts, so this is LDPRED cardiogram versus LDPRED UK Biobank, it's, you know, it's almost random. So there's not so much overlap. And so if I decide to prescribe a treatment to people, if I base that on UK Biobank summary statistics or cardiogram summary statistics, I'm going to come up with a whole different set of people. Another way to visualize that is to show you just how much people shift between different scores in terms of their absolute rank. So I'm here taking around 1,000 random people from the UK Biobank. I'm not sure if you can read the variables at the bottom. It doesn't make, I mean, it's not super important. I'm also showing clump scores that only have genome-wide significance SNPs. But you see, I mean, people go up and down. They can score high on one score and then low on another score. And it's just, you know, there's huge variation. Now, still as a researcher or as a clinician, the question is, so which score do I use? You know, I use the best one, but still, even the best score is not the true polygenic score, right? It doesn't have 100% explained heritability. And as GWAS samples grow, we're gonna get different scores. And again, I can create these, I can recreate these figures and they're gonna look different again. So that's why we did some simulations. Asking ourselves, what if we know what the true polygenic score is? What level of explained heritability do we need to put someone in the correct polygenic score quintile? So that's when we want an accurate prediction of someone's genetic risk. And explained heritability is basically the explained variance of the polygenic score over the total SNP-based heritability. And how heritable should a trait be to put someone in the correct trait quintile? So that's when we want an accurate prediction of someone's outcome. So the two questions that we're trying to answer here. So the first question is, what if I want an accurate prediction of someone's genetic risk? What we're doing here is we're varying the explained SNP heritability. And then on the y-axis, you see the fraction correctly classified in the top quintile of a polygenic score. And we saw that it doesn't matter what the actual SNP-based heritability is, it's all about explained SNP-based heritability. So just taking the example of education attainment has around a SNP heritability of around 25%. And currently a phenotypic explained variance of around 12%. So that's currently, with current scores, we are capturing around 50% of the SNP-based heritability. Now let's put that on this plot. It basically shows that with current scores, we only correctly classify around 55% of individuals in the top polygenic score quintile. So even though I think we're doing, much better with education and with a lot of diseases, putting people correctly in the top quintile of polygenic score, performance is not so great. And this result holds for, I'm picking up education attainment. You could do this for any level of heritability. Then another question we can ask is that, let's say we ran a huge GWAS and we're capturing all of the SNP-based heritability. How often do we put people correctly in the top quintile of a trait? So here it's not explained SNP-based heritability in the x-axis, it's the actual heritability with the assumption that we're capturing 100% of it. And this is the fraction correctly classified in the top quintile of a trait. Again, showing a heritability of 90% is needed to classify 80% of individuals correctly in the top trait quintile. And I think, that's not even SNP-based heritability that we're seeing for something like height. So even if we would have 100% SNP-based heritability that we're capturing, that we're explaining, we need, it's just on the basis of genetic data alone, we're not predicting outcomes accurately at all. Then showing that again for educational attainment. I keep using this one because it's so controversial. People saying, oh, we should use the genetic score and put people in different classes or give them extra attention. And this is just showing how poor that prediction actually is. So let's say I'm putting the heritability at 25%. That's for education attainment. How often do we put people correctly in the top quintile of education attainment? Varying the explained SNP-based heritability. So currently we're at around 50%. But of course, GWAS are going to get larger. We're going to capture more of that explained SNP-based heritability. But even with 100% SNP-based heritability, classification into the top quintile of education attainment is going to be accurate only 40% of the time. So not deterministic at all. Yeah, so it's almost kind of, I don't want to be too bleak. I'm kind of the person working with education and socioeconomic status. So for me, it's in my best interest to say I cannot predict individual outcomes with that, and that's kind of like my angle. But of course, still, like, polygenic scores are associated with increased probability of disease. And even this paper from 2015 showed that if you give people statins in the highest quintile of a polygenic score for cardiovascular disease, these people are going to benefit from treatment much more than people who are not scoring high. And this was based on a polygenic score of only 27 variants. So you can imagine what that's like with new polygenic score. At the same time, rigidly relying on rank from a polygenic score may lead to misinformed decision-making. So polygenic score construction method makes a difference. The selection of discovery subsets makes a difference. And then the question really is, what other risk factors do we have to supplement in our prediction model? So and that's actually what clinicians are doing for cardiovascular disease. They're not focusing on genetic risk only, they're using other risk factors. And of course, with more research, we're learning more about how to make better models. I'm just saying, don't rely on the genetics alone. Then the usefulness of the polygenic scores for individuals depends on the trait, of course. So the question really is, how harmful is a false positive or treatment received unnecessarily? If a treatment is, hey, we're just going to give you some extra screening, then that doesn't seem so harmful to me. And I think polygenic scores are can be very useful. Also, statin treatment is a type of drug that tends to not have that many side effects. So that's something that you're saying, oh, well, if I'm giving statins to the wrong people, perhaps that's not so bad. Then there's also a risk of stigmatization and social effects, of course, and that's especially when we're speaking of education. I would say, if the treatment is separating kids in different classes, that's harmful. So, I mean, how useful polygenic scores definitely depends on what you're looking at. Then another thing I just wanted to raise is, and it's not something I'm seeing addressed in any recent papers, but perhaps I'm wrong, is how do we actually envision implementation? I mean, are we just going to genotype every individual from birth? Are we just going to create polygenic scores for every well-powered GWAS that we have? You can imagine that, say, cardiologists say, I want the cardiovascular score. The nephrologists say, well, I want the score for kidney disease because I want to target those people. The endocrinologists are like, well, I want a diabetes score. I mean, what type of cocktails of treatments are we going to give people if we're creating polygenic scores for them for every type of disease? And how are we going to protect those people's data from insurance companies or other people who could misuse data? And how does a patient wishes and informed consent come in here? Is there a patient saying, well, my family history of cardiovascular disease, I just want treatment on that score, but nothing else? What if we created other scores for that patient? Are we just not going to say anything? Practically, statistically, we're seeing that there's use, but practically, how would this be implemented? And that's something that, I would like to hear your comments on. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I don't think I'll be able to hear any of you, but I see that there's some comments in the chat or Q&A. Poik, I don't know if you want to read them out. If I should read them.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. You're welcome to read them as well. And thank you for an incredibly clear and interesting talk. I'm going to start with a question. There's lots of questions coming in, so I'm just going to try and field it as best I can. So someone has asked, has any of the work comparing scores been published? And it's very interesting that scores disagree so much.
Yeah, no, I hope we'll have a working paper before the end of the year. We're still I didn't even show you every type of graphic we tried for, comparing scores. That's something that we were kind of struggling with a lot. What's the best way to show this? We kind of just started with tables, like cutting up the scores and just seeing how many people are on the diagonal and how many people are outside the diagonal. So we're still playing around with the graphics, but we're at a very advanced draft. So I hope it will be published on an archive server before the end of the year, or early next year.
Great, thank you. And a question from Lahiru. Should we combine polygenic scores with information about exposure to environmental risk factors? And if so, can you speculate how much this approach might improve the model for a trait like cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, I must say I'm not actually an expert on cardiovascular disease. It was just like an interesting trait because there's been so much amazing work in the past. And the people already have such clear ideas on who to target. So, there is this prediction model that I showed that was an American College of Cardiologists. And that's based on Framingham, Eric, some other American cohorts. And what you need is follow-up data, right? In order to have a risk model of who's going to develop a disease, you need this longitudinal data. And I'm kind of trusting that if it's that Eric and Framingham heart study are doing the best they can. So I don't know what else you could use. I'm kind of like surprised that BMI didn't make it. Apparently that was already, captured by the blood cholesterol. So there's smoking, there's diabetes. Surprised there's no family history is not in there. But I mean, yeah, I wonder what other risk factors could be possible. I think I'm kind of trusting that the models they have, because it's based on longitudinal data, it's probably some of the best that, that's out there.
Okay, that's interesting because I guess some of these conclusions might change a little bit with a different type of risk model. Okay, and then there's a second question from Lahiru. So ethnic minorities, such as South Asians, often have the highest risk of cardiovascular disease. And can you comment on the ethics of using mainly Northern European samples to create polygenic risk scores with the aim of future clinical application?
Oh, that's another one. I mean, that's not even touching upon that. So we have these scores that say we can make accurate predictions, but we're only making them for white people, basically. I mean, that's gonna cause, there are already health disparities, and that's just gonna increase them. I mean, at the same time, like if you have good information on who's gonna develop a heart attack, should you not use that if you have that? It's and I know that this recent biobank effort was just, I think it was a preprint that was just published showing, just how many different Asian biobanks, especially, I don't know if there was African participants that they had, but just trying to, people are definitely working on that, where they're trying to pull data from different ancestries and trying to solve this issue, because it's something, if we just keep going the way that we're going, it's gonna increase health disparities. For sure.
Yeah, and that's certainly a topic that deserves a lot of attention. So question from Mariana. So on one of your slides, when showing a scatter plot from the study of Lee on educational polygenic risk scores with actual educational attainments, is there a stratifying variable that has been omitted? So that's where you have the two groups and the balloons, if that makes sense.
Wait. If I can go back to that one, the two groups on the balloons. Wait, what did I?
Yeah.
On education attainment.
Yeah, maybe.
Was that my work or was that in the? Wait, maybe I'm gonna look at the question again.
Yeah. It's in the chat. Yeah.
Seems there are two groups. Oh. Yeah, perhaps. I don't know. It's true. It's true. It seems that I noticed that as well. So I think so. I think what they did here is they did years of education controlling for sex, birth year, and ancestry. And probably, I mean, health and retirement study people who are older. There are people in retirement, near retirement, or already deceased. And I can imagine that, especially around that time, there were fewer educational opportunities for women. And if I could speculate, I would say the women are kind of this lower bubble and the men are kind of the higher bubble. That's my, so maybe for this, it would make more sense to stratify instead of control. That's my, but yeah, I noticed the same. I would think this is men versus women.
Yeah, and Emily had a similar question about stratifying your analysis by sex as well, which is the point I think you just answered. Yeah,
I mean, it's not something that we ever thought about, but it might be worth looking into, especially like with making these scatter plots and these kind of patterns become apparent, but we haven't done that. I mean, especially for heart disease, right? You're seeing different mechanisms for men versus women. And I don't know if the genetic correlation for men versus women is significantly different from one, if it's the same genetic effects for men versus women. Like that's something we should probably at least report. And then if it's not one, then we should stratify.
Okay, and a question from Justin. For the statin treatment, would using a score based on a GWAS from the same population as the patient provide greater consistency and therefore less method dependence?
So I was just a bit distracted. Wait, for statin treatment, would using a polygenic score based on a GWAS? Oh, I mean, that's something I thought about with this UK Biobank data. I mean, that might be the reason why we're seeing a better predictive accuracy of the UK Biobank scores, right? Because it's the same source population, basically. So I think for some applications that might make more sense, but I think the best way to go forward is always to just use the best score. That's what we're doing, you know, seeing which score has the highest R-square. But yeah, I mean, it depends. Like something for education, we're definitely seeing that scores for American populations are very different than the scores we have for UK Biobank. Like there's not a genetic correlation between 23andMe and UK Biobank is very significantly not one. So yeah, it depends, I suppose.
There's a similar question, I think almost as a follow-up from Kevin in the chat about the lack of concordance between the score based on biobank and cardiogram using the same method, and perhaps the regions of the genome that create those problems. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, like what would that be if you're using the same method? I think it's partially Blink, just the reason I said like just throwing out information that you probably have more than one causal SNP in the LD block and you're throwing out that information. So it's just noise. So that's one hypothesis. The other one is they're maybe capturing different genetic processes. I guess it depends on the genetic architecture of the trait. So if you're something that's super polygenic, like education, probably definitely make more sense to use LDPRED. Whereas for something like Alzheimer's, which is oligogenic, then maybe there's not so much of a difference. So I think probably, or if you have a trait that has HLA as a you know, HLA region as a causal you know, a region, that might be that the modeling makes a huge difference. I think it's just noise with Blink that it's adding. That's my hunch.
Okay, and another question from Mariana about using an ensemble score, where you classify people based how often they're in the top decile for different methods.
Yeah, I mean, so that's what we're thinking about. So who are these people that are like, you know, that are scoring high in every single score, right? Like, is that the question? Like people and saying these are the people we should target. I don't think that's the best strategy, because we're just seeing, I mean, with this one, it kind of, I don't know if for this population in the UK Biobank, where the UK Biobank score works better, I don't know if I want to incorporate that information who also score high on cardiogram. So these are the people at the very center. I might be more interested in these people who score high on the UK Biobank scores. So I'm not sure. And then again, none of these are the true score. So I wouldn't know, like if I was a clinician, which one I would use. If I would say, well, you know, I'm using the people in the center, people are scoring high in every single one. Am I just gonna, I think my preferred score would just be the best score and looking at the top quintile for these people. I think that's what I would do, but it would still be imperfect.
Great. And two questions from Willie in the Q&A. So looking at the second one first, I guess that's a comment. So there's base editing and CRISPR technologies that will almost be like a vaccine against elevated low density cholesterol with lipoprotein particles. So this kind of risk stratification might be even more helpful in the future. And then a question, I guess, which is a little bit
Interesting.
Separate to the topic of the presentation about whether the phenotype of educational attainment means anything if you take out cognitive ability. So what is educational attainment conditional on ability? If you want to answer that, but it's a little bit different to what you're talking about, I guess.
Yeah, just looking at cognitive ability, I mean, it's just a worse score. It's if we're taking out, I mean, you could do that with this genomic SEM method, and we take out the non-cognitive part. Yeah, I think it's just, so what if I do, yeah, So then, I mean, the analogy would be like, I do it for TrainFeedMe, I do that for UK Biobank, I do all these different methods. I think I'm just going to see more dispersion. But maybe I should. I was thinking, like, should we do this for education? Do this type of thing where I'm trying to make a model with non-genetic predictors and then add the genetic predictors and see who is really in the bottom. And I guess you could do that for non-cognitive versus cognitive scores, but I don't know if I want to go there.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested in that, Tim Morris at Bristol with George Davy Smith and Neil Davis gave a talk to our center a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic. And very similar findings to you, that these predictions are unstable across quintiles or other categorization of an educational attainment risk score. So there would be absolutely no hope of using it for a person-specific stratification. Can I ask you, we've got a little bit of time, 2 or 3 minutes left. If any other questions would like to be asked, then put them in the Q&A or the chat. Do you think we're holding polygenic risk scores to a different standards compared to other risk factors? So for example, if I had a cardiovascular prediction model and I have smoking, I could measure that with self-reported smoking. I could measure DNA methylation, which is probably the best way of measuring smoking history. I could have some other measure of smoking. And over time, these different types of risk factor have been included in prediction models. And likewise, we could have self-reported BMI, which we know is very, very inaccurate and often biased downwards. That it's possibly natural that we have an evolution in the accuracy of risk scores or predictors that we put into our risk models, and that these will change over time. So in a sense, I think this work is super, super valuable, and I hope people are sensitive to it. But do you think this is almost expected, that we're very early in the evolution of polygenic risk scores, and as time goes on, we'll slowly move toward the best risk score potentially? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, for something like cardiovascular disease, we're seeing a SNP-based heritability of 5%. And then when I'm going to, I would really like, I think as a clinician, I'd really like to see those other risk factors become, as an earlier question also was asking, we would like to see these other risk factors become more accurate, or more widely measured or whatever. It depends on the disease, I think. So I know which one is the most promising. I thought that, probably the cancers, although this is my kind of plea, if you're a cancer researcher, reach out to make those subsets public, because that's huge annoyance and nuisance of people trying to access cancer subsets. It's, for a lot of cancers, impossible. So that was also based on this I'm not going to go back, but like this number needed to treat for the prostate and the breast cancer, they were looking pretty good. But in terms, I think it's probably the most promising for the diseases with a high heritability that are maybe rare. So we just need to find more cases to put in the GWAS. But for cardiovascular, SNP-based heritability 5%, it's not, awesome. And I can imagine that with the polygenic scores gaining, more explained variance, a lot of that stuff going into the polygenic score, I can imagine it's also genetic propensity, lifestyle behaviors. So I can imagine that these things start correlating as well. And that a polygenic score is not going to be that much more useful as in combination with lifestyle variables.
Yeah, and I think all of that has to be determined in research that needs to be done, and whether it would be worth clinically and for the patient and financially to collect these informations and do screening. So we're just coming up to 1 hour. So I just want to sincerely thank you for a really fantastic, high quality talk. And thank you everyone who joined us and who asked questions. We have recorded this talk, so we'll be on YouTube quite soon, possibly this week, if you want to revisit it. And I'll just conclude again with thanking Fleur for an absolutely fantastic talk. And we will certainly keep an eye on this research as it develops. So thank you again, and I'll say goodbye to everyone now, if that's all right. Thank you.
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you for having me.